Welcome to Sports Science Dudes. I am your host, Dr. Jose Antonio. Today's show is part 2 of a series with Jeff Young, in which he interviews me a little bit about our guest. Jeff Young, he has an MS in exercise and sports science. He's a doctoral student pursuing his EDD in kinesiology. He's also a certified strength and conditioning specialist. He works mainly in medical fitness and has worked at world-class facilities such as Duke, UCLA, and Beth Israel Medical Centers, and as the founding fitness coordinator and faculty practice provider at Mount Sinai Medical Center for Health and Healing in New York City, the most comprehensive urban-based academic integrative medicine and medical fitness facility in the US at the time. So I'd like to welcome Jeff back. He gets to quiz me, and we're going to have a fun time with this conversation.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me back. And again, for your listeners, I teach a nutrition and health course at the City University of New York, or CUNY, York College in Jamaica, Queens. And this is a blessing for me. This is a blessing for our students, and this is a blessing for the institution. So really appreciate you having me back. And today's topic is on sports nutrition. The last time was protein. This time is sports nutrition, and I look forward to asking the questions and picking your brain. And let's dive right into it.
Okay, sounds good.
First question is going to be on first principles or fundamentals of sports nutrition. So the question is, what would you consider the core fundamentals of sports nutrition that apply to most, if not all, athletes, regardless of their sport or level of competition?
Yeah, I'm a big fan of this. I think things should be kept simple for the most part. Diet and or sports nutrition, I think, should never be about mathematics. I think one of the first mistakes people make is that they start to count carbs, count fat, count protein, count calories, when in fact there are some simple things that you should do, and there might be one thing that I would suggest you count. So I think, broadly speaking, to anyone, whether they're a high-end athlete, recreational athlete, a jolly jogger, a high-end runner, weightlifter, or whatever, making sure that you pursue a diet, basically a diet program that you can comply with, rather than sort of following, the latest, whether it's, eating carnivore, eating keto, or whatever. It's got to be something you follow. With that said, whenever I give, seminar to groups of people looking for, I guess people want secrets. There's like, well, what's the secret to, high performance vis-a-vis nutrition? And I tell people there's no secrets. In fact, I start with really simple things. People are often, surprised, like, well, that's kind of simple. And I say it's simple because most people can't follow the simple stuff. If you can't master the simple stuff, you're not going to master the difficult and complicated stuff. So for instance, again, I don't tell people to count stuff except for protein. And the reason why is this. I tell people, as a goal, try to get 1 gram of protein per pound of body weight. And most people think, oh, that's kind of easy. If I weigh 150 pounds, that's under 50 grams of protein. But apparently it isn't as easy as it seems, because you have to be conscious of what you eat to hit that goal. Most people who don't, if they don't think about it, like for instance, I'm around college kids all the time and I talk to the athletes, most of them actually don't get 1 gram per pound or 2.2 grams per kilo. Because their eating habits are bad, they might skip breakfast. It's just a mess. So 1 gram per pound, that's all I ask. Now people say, well, what about carbs and fat? And my feeling on this, particularly with most people, is that no one's ever come up to me and said, you know what? I have a hard time eating carbs and fat. I just don't know where do I get these foods? Because it's so easy to eat carbs and fat. It's less easy to eat adequate protein. So get the 1 gram per pound, backfill the rest of your diet with carbs and fat. And if you're an athlete that isn't interested in gaining or losing weight, you sort of figure out what that baseline intake is. And if you've been weight stable for a while, then you're eating enough. So, and that's, you don't have to count carbs, you don't have to count fat. Just make sure you count protein, because it's important, for body composition, recovery, and all that. And then the other thing is, in general, follow up a sort of a meal plan or eating plan where you're eating at regular intervals. People will say, well, if I'm getting 1 gram per pound, could I do it in one meal? I mean, technically, I guess you could. I don't know many people who can practically do that, but it makes more sense to just spread your meals over, let's say, spread your calories and protein, carbs, and fat over 3 or 4 meals over the course of the day. So really, it's a few simple things. 1 gram per pound of protein, spread your meals, no need to count carbs and fat. And if you are stable, then you're getting enough calories.
I love it. And and I couldn't agree more. The fundamentals are simple and we need to just stick to simplicity. You actually remind me of I do a lot of lecturing on exercise science and resistance training programming principles. And uh, I remember many years ago when I was working in this Mount Sinai system and was just getting started presenting at conferences. And one of the clinicians that I work with, Phil, there was one like Monday morning where he said, "Didn't you just present like over the weekend or something like that?" And I said, "Yeah." And he goes, "You've been doing a lot of presenting lately." And I said, "Yeah." And he goes, "What do you present on?" And I said, "You know what I present on? I present on the kindergarten fundamental concepts that everybody seems to have strayed from." And so, yeah, I love hearing you say that. But I do have a related question. You're actually kind of reminding me,
Mhm.
if my memory serves correct, undergrad, Penn State, nutrition, and they would talk about or the professor would talk about that step one is determine your total calorie intake so that now you have like your
Mhm.
sphere of what your calorie
Mhm.
intake is, and then number two is protein, and as whether it's a pound like you just mentioned, a pound per I'm sorry, a gram per
A
pound.
gram per pound.
Yeah, but figure that out next, and then from there you can divvy up your fats and your carbs. Is that still a general fundamental that you would agree with, or
I don't disagree with it. You're just adding one more thing to assess or measure.
right?
So if people do that, that's great. What I try to do is keep it so simple that it's hard to fail. Now,
Yeah, I love it.
with that said, it's still, 1 gram per pound. People think, well, how much protein is in a chicken breast? How much
Right.
protein? At least when you buy a protein shake, you know how many grams you're getting, plus or minus 10%. But if you start adding things that need to be measured or assessed, I think compliance starts to drop. So
Yeah.
now I have worked with, and I'm sure you have as well. I've worked with a few people who are very, very good. They treat nutrition the same way they treat training. They're very exact, they're very precise, and they have a plan. But most people don't do that. So in a way, I'm catering to, okay, I'm talking to the laziest of the group. This is what I want you to do.
Yeah.
If you can do this, then we'll do something a little bit more complex.
Okay. Good.
Yeah.
I do have one more follow-up question, and that is, how do these foundational principles adapt when working with athletes of different disciplines, especially if it's the opposite end of the continuum where you're working with endurance athletes versus strength or power athletes?
That's a good question. So you deal with the extremes of the continuum, endurance versus strength power. In general, if you're dealing with strength power athletes, I don't think you should worry as much about carb and or fat intake. I think those guys, well, let's talk about males. Those males and or females probably tend to be larger than most in terms of body mass index or body weight. So they're getting calories as it is, unless they're in a weight class sport like weightlifting, then there's really no need for them to watch, particularly their carb and fat intake as long as they get their protein intake. The other extreme, so let's take, and then this is what's interesting. So let's take the endurance athlete. I can tell you what the literature says. The literature says you got to eat, you got to consume much more carbs, anywhere from 5 to 10 grams per kilo. However, and this is where it gets interesting, and this is what I call there's the art and science of sports nutrition. This is where the art comes in. When I talk to endurance athletes, and that's who I'm mostly around now because I do stand-up paddling, my wife's a competitive cyclist. I talk to them and ask what they do in terms of diet. One, most of them don't really pay attention to diet the way they should. And two, there's not a single human being that I know that consumes 5 to 10 grams of carbs per kilo. Nobody. So I'm thinking, okay, well, that's what the literature says. How come no one does? And we're talking about people who win races. We're not talking about the recreational person who's, finishing 500th out of 1,000. These are people who win races. It's like, wait a minute, the literature says this, but you're doing this. In fact, my wife, she's a competitive cyclist. She won the USA cycling time trials in her age group last year, so probably win it again this year. She's on a very high protein and what some would call a lowish carb diet. Low carb meaning about 3 grams per kilo. High protein meaning 3 grams per kilo.
Wow.
So that is the antithesis of what you see in the literature.
Yeah.
So when people say, well, okay, it comes back to the question, well, then how much carbs should I eat? And I think and this is where endurance, I think people clump endurance athletes all together. If you're, let's say, a miler, so you do 4 laps around the track, do you really need that much carbs? I don't think so. What if you run to 10,000, 10K? Okay, I bet your training volume's higher. You probably need more carbs. Now, what if you're a 30-year-old male and you want to do the half marathon or the New York City Marathon next year? Okay, now you would probably need not just more carbs, but more total calories. So when you look at endurance athletes on the sort of the shorter range, shorter distances, I don't think it's an issue in terms of getting enough carbs. Focus on protein, make sure you get enough calories. Once you start bumping up the distances, I think that's when carb intake is critically important. But when you think about it, it's not just carb intake, it's total calorie intake. So everything has to go up. So let's bring it back to something pragmatic. If you just like to work out, maybe you lift a couple days a week, maybe you run, but you prefer to run, and you're like, hey, I'm going to do the turkey trot 5K. Last year I did it in 21 minutes. This year I want to do it in 20 minutes. Does it really matter in terms of getting 5 to 10 carbs per kilo? I personally don't think so. A lot would disagree. So what does I think if you're trying to, let's say, set a PR in a 5K, and again, that's a fairly short race, maybe you should train yourself to consume carbs before the race. So you do this in training, and then train yourself to consume maybe a little bit during the race. We do know pre and or during race carb intake will help performance, but it's so important that every meal has to be high carb. I would say no. If you're training for a marathon, it's probably a little different.
This is great. I love it. And one of the things you hit on that again, I'm a big believer in is that just a general concept that nearly everything lies on a continuum, especially when we're talking about
Yes.
health, right? Training, whatever the case. And that's actually what my mind does a lot is it just looks at the continuum and where does the person lie on the continuum, and then that's going to lead to what the approach is. And you just talked about a continuum of volume and the relationship between your carb intake based on the volume. So I love it.
Well, let me tell you a quick story. One of my good friends, Victoria Burgess, if she listens to the show, maybe she'll get a kick out of this. This many years ago, she trained to be the second human to paddle from Cuba to Florida. So that's a long distance, obviously. That's an ultra. So when she first approached me about this, she's like, well, what should I do for nutrition? And I said, you know what? What you're doing actually is quite simple. If you're paddling from Cuba to Florida, which will take a day, so think about you're up for a day. I know the skill part is good. She can paddle. She could do it so skill is not an issue. Ocean paddling, which by the way is very dangerous. Not many people can do it. I said, for you got to make sure your brain is awake for 24 hours. And it ended up, she took 27 hours, but that your brain is awake for 24 hours and that you teach yourself to eat while you paddle. So when she trained, I'd say, you just got to bring food with you. Whatever food you think works, you got to eat and train your gut to handle food, because for 24 hours, you're not going to be sleeping. You're going to be moving. And once the brain gives, you're done. And you don't want the brain to give. So in a way, the ultras are kind of easy because it's like, get dietary energy. I didn't even tell her about protein, carbs, fat. I'm like, if you eat enough, you're going to do well. So yeah, that's an example where you're talking about an extreme, which is different than the high school kid who runs the mile. So I would never tell a kid who's training for the mile, you know what, just eat everything, pizza, cupcakes, So that's a real life example where you take the literature and you're like, okay, let's fit it to what this person wants to do.
That is great. So interesting. All right, let's move to the next question, which is on the timing of nutrient intake. So, how significant is the timing of nutrient intake, especially when it comes to protein and carbs around training sessions? So you alluded to that a little bit, but maybe we can dive a little bit deeper.
Okay, I'll give you the quick, simple answer. It's not important, but then I'll tell you why it is important. So, because this is asked quite frequently. I think the challenge is, one, nutrient timing is often equated with protein timing, but we know nutrient timing also includes carb timing, which we know carb timing helps performance. So, but let's set that aside. Let's just talk about protein. when you're dealing with protein intake, and again, this is the one thing I tell people to measure, the question that needs to be asked, is there ever an advantage to not consuming protein after you train? The simple answer to that is no. Is there a potential advantage to consuming protein after you train? The answer to that is yes, and it's not for the reason people think. If you need 200 grams of protein over the course of the day, why don't you get 40 or 50 after you work out, which is typically when you're slightly dehydrated, maybe you're a little hungry. So you've gotten 1/4 of your total protein intake just by drinking a shake. So to me, it represents an opportunity to consume protein so that you meet your total protein goals. There's nothing magical about you train, you drink protein, oh my God, skeletal muscle hypertrophy, mitochondrial biogenesis. It's not that. It's that you're trying to attain a certain amount throughout the entire day. So let's say you skip, you work out and you're like, I just won't eat for 3 hours. Well, now you've missed this sort of window where you could possibly be getting enough protein so that you maximize your ability to recover, that day and the next day. So it's weird that the simple answer is no, it doesn't matter, but it matters from a pragmatic standpoint. And as Jeff, as you know, I think you're starting to get the notion that I tend to view these things almost solely from a practical or pragmatic
I
standpoint.
love it.
And I use science sort of as a roadmap, but I don't always have to follow the roadmap exactly.
Exactly. And I mean, we are so identical when it comes to that. I mean,
Good.
I'm telling you, that's literally how I go about life. The science is a guide, but it's all about
Yep.
practical, and it helps to be older, and it helps to have decades of experience under your belt, so you can learn a little bit about the practical side. So without a doubt, but yeah, I totally agree.
It's funny. Yeah. It's funny you say helps me older. It is true that when I hear students first learn these concepts, it's almost like they hear something and they repeat it like a parrot. And it's like, well, no, you can't treat this like you're repeating something like a parrot because it may not always apply. So it's
Yeah.
true, with age comes wisdom or whatnot. So, although with age comes wisdom, but with age, your body just doesn't recover from exercise. So.
Isn't that the truth? All
Yeah.
right, well, let's move in. Let's move from this to the branched chain amino acids and this whole pre-workout supplement thing. So there's a lot of debate around the efficacy and safety of certain supplements like BCAAs and pre-workout. But from your perspective, what does the evidence really say about their effectiveness?
Okay, pre-workout supplements. What's interesting about this category is that virtually none of the ingredients in a pre-workout supplement have a timing issue, except caffeine, maybe citrulline, maybe the nitrates. But creatine, there's no timing issue with creatine. There's no timing issue with beta alanine. So people say, well, should I take it? And my answer to that is, well, it is a practical way to get all of those things at once. So that's the reason to take it. But don't think that there's something that, the pre-workout, the word pre, the prefix, it's not necessary per se that, these supplements need to be taken pre-workout. It's just convenient to take it pre-workout. Again, going back to sort of nutrient timing, there's nothing magical about it, but if you consume protein after your workout, you're helping meet your total protein needs. Now, specifically the branched chain amino acids, which is interesting because I see so many scientists just beat the crap out of this online, and I'm thinking, okay, branched chain amino acids certainly are not as good as whole protein, especially whey protein, when it comes to enhancing muscle protein synthesis. We know that. It has a little effect, but not a significant effect. However, there's context to everything. Is there a role for branched chain amino acids? Yes, if you look at the literature, there is plenty of evidence to show that branched chain amino acid supplementation decreases delayed onset muscle soreness. So I always ask people, is there ever an advantage to being sore? If you're in a skill sport, baseball, softball, football, none. You don't want to be sore because if you're engaging in a skill, let's say you're a golfer, you don't want to ever be sore because that's a very high skill movement. Baseball pitcher, you do not want to be sore. So what's the harm of taking branched chain amino acids? Now, the typical answer I get back is, well, why don't you just consume more protein? And I say, yes, you could do that too. These are not mutually exclusive choices. I mean, if you want to drive from Miami to Jacksonville, you could take your Prius or you could take your Ferrari. It gets there. They all get there. So to me, it's it's sort of a personal preference. Why do some people choose branched chains? Because it's, for some people, easier to consume 10 to 15 grams of it than to consume whole protein. So I think here's the problem, I think, in sports nutrition. And this applies to scientists as well, because a lot of them come from the viewpoint, they see sports nutrition as bodybuilding nutrition. It's like,
Yes.
well, if that's not going to, help me gain muscle mass, then it's a waste of time. Well, whoa, whoa, whoa. Believe it or not, most people aren't bodybuilders. They're
Yes.
not. I mean, but for better or worse, bodybuilding nutrition has played such a big part in viewing sports nutrition that oftentimes, even when I'll read social media posts from friends of mine, it's like, well, it is a waste of time. I go, hey, there's no skeletal muscle hypertrophy. Well, guess what? There are a lot of athletes who have no interest in skeletal muscle hypertrophy. So once we remember that sports nutrition is not bodybuilding nutrition, it encompasses all these other sports where gaining weight is a no-no. In fact, I'll give you a simple example. One of my colleagues, Corey Peacock, he trains mixed martial arts fighters. They fight, they fight in a specific weight class. They don't want to gain weight because now they're fighting guys who are much larger. So here's an interesting pragmatic tidbit. Should they take creatine? And that's a good question. I've talked to some strength coaches say, no, I don't have them take creatine at all because I don't want them to have to move up a weight class. Others will say, we'll have them take creatine, but maybe 4 weeks before a fight, they'll have them titrate off it. So here you got strength coaches, different points of view, looking at, okay, I don't want my fighter to be in a different weight class. So this guy will say no creatine. This guy will say 4 weeks before the fight, drop your creatine. And so again, we got to look at sports nutrition as not just bodybuilding. And so that's why, sports nutrition is for distance running, it's for cycling, it's for fighting, it's for Olympic weightlifting. It's not just bodybuilding.
You just hit on something I'm very passionate about, and I don't know if you've seen me post this on Facebook or social media or whatever, but this is something that that the whole hypertrophy and bodybuilding landscape is dominating the
Yeah,
landscape, at least from what I can see.
it
And
is.
yeah, it really is. And so everyone's thinking about, getting jacked, and that
Yeah.
it's all about hypertrophy and et cetera. And uh one of the ways that I approach this is, especially from an athlete standpoint, hey, it's also about conditioning, strength, and power, and even when Bill Kramer was guest lecturing for my students earlier this semester in the strength and conditioning course, he touched on this a little bit, and I'm paraphrasing, but the gist of it was, hey, hypertrophy is kind of gonna happen if you're taking sets to add or near, especially from a resistance training standpoint. It's
Yeah.
kind of gonna happen, and then there's ways we can optimize it and maximize it. But again, going back to my point is that yes, here we go again. I'm totally on the same page. I'm passionate about this. The landscape is way bigger than just hypertrophy and getting jacked. There's a lot more to it, whether it's from a resistance training, exercise science, or sports nutrition standpoint.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, and something else, in my master's program when we went through the sports nutrition course, our particular instructor for that course seemed to be kind of trying to drill into our heads that, again, in the landscape of supplements, that a lot of them either aren't safe or don't do what they claim they're supposed to do, which leads to a follow-up question I have on this topic: that if students wanted to use supplements, what criteria should they use to evaluate whether a product is worth their time and money?
Yeah, I think one thing, they have to have a clearly defined goal. So if you take bodybuilding, for example, the goal is clearly defined. It's muscle hypertrophy or gains in lean mass. So what could help you gain lean mass? Well, clearly protein intake is important. Also, creatine monohydrate helps. Beta alanine. Does beta alanine help? Probably from an indirect standpoint, in that it can help you train harder. So that's a good thing. What about the nitrates? Well, let's see. That might help increase blood flow. Maybe that'll help you train harder. So again, indirectly, it might help. So I think once someone has a specific goal that they want to reach, I think it becomes easier to figure out which supplements to use. Now, with that said, people say, well, what supplements work? And here's what's interesting. It's, again, going back to, it's the simple stuff that works. If your diet is dialed in, you get 1 gram per pound of protein, you're consuming sufficient carbs and fat. There's really only a handful of supplements that I recommend that that there's a lot of data to support, whether it's creatine or it's caffeine, it's beta alanines and nitrates. I even recommend a multivitamin, not because here's the thing, oh, there's no data to show multivitamins do this and that. How about this? Take a multivitamin just as an insurance policy. You may not eat perfectly all the time. It's sort of like, I give the analogy, do you buy car insurance with the intent of getting in an accident? No, you buy car insurance because you don't want to get in an accident. So again, it's just an insurance policy. So there's really not, there's really only a few basic supplements that you need to take. Now, there's what I call auxiliary or accessory supplements. Like, for instance, I take glucosamine. In fact, I've been taking it probably for 20 years.
Wow.
Before I got really old, now that I'm old, but before middle age, I'm like, you know what, maybe I should start taking glucosamine because the data shows that glucosamine may help with joint health. So I've been taking that, for 2 decades. So there are those supplements that don't directly affect performance, which I think are important. Another one would be omega-3 fatty acids. I have friends who literally will not touch fish. They won't eat sushi. They won't eat sashimi. It's like, how do you get your, your N3 fatty acids? And a lot of them are like, well, I don't, because I don't like fish oil either. So like, oh, okay, well, we know the data on fish oil, it's good for the heart, et cetera, might even decrease the late onset muscle soreness. So there's those supplements that they don't directly impact performance, but because they contribute to overall health, maybe in the long run, it might contribute to performance. Put it this way, my philosophy going back when I first started to get into sports nutrition and supplements was this: if it helps or has a neutral effect, you should try it. Because the worst thing that could happen is nothing happens. And that's how I view multivitamins. That's how I view other supplements that I might take. So again, you got to be pragmatic.
Yeah. This is great. And you've been really for our whole conversation here, we've been talking a lot about performance, obviously, because that's what sports nutrition is about. And this reminds me on the subject of can you outrun a bad diet? Now, bear with me for a second here. I recently saw a
Okay.
TikTok like days ago. And I think it's Calvin Johnson, Megatron from the Detroit Lions, the wide receiver. And I don't know if what he was claiming is if he was being completely truthful, but he was basically saying that he would eat one meal a day and it would just be dinner. And that throughout the course of the day, he was eating candy. He was eating gummy bears and, Skittles and things like that. So, and he claimed that he would only eat one meal a day. So now let's bridge this back to, can you outrun a bad diet? I look at that topic. First of all, I think this is a really ambiguous question that needs a lot more context
Yep.
and detail. And I look at it from 3 standpoints. Can we outrun it from a weight management standpoint? Can we outrun it from a health standpoint? But here, if you want to touch on those 2 things, you can. But here, I'm talking more about from a performance standpoint. And we know there's definitely plenty of literature out there that shows that there's a lot of athletes who have crappy diets. We know it anecdotally. Research shows it. Calvin Johnson is just one example of someone who eats like crap and yet still is able to reach the elite level. And I'll say one last thing. In this doctoral program I'm in, the particular course I'm in right now, one of my classmates is pursuing a PhD in sports nutrition, and we're talking about the dissertation, and she touched on this a little bit, where I don't think she worded it, "Can you outrun a bad diet?" But it was alluding to that, and so that's my question to you from a performance standpoint. If you want to touch on health and weight, you can, but at least from a performance standpoint, how why are people like the Calvin Johnsons of the world outrunning a bad diet and elite? And we can't clone him. We can't create a Calvin Johnson A and B. And so how much does a healthy diet really matter? And as it compared to genetics and training and all that stuff? What's your response to that?
No, this is a fun question. Let me address the weight loss or weight management one, and then the second one was health, and then
Health,
the third
yes.
one's performance, right?
Yes.
Because when I see that question, it's almost within the context of losing weight management.
Yes.
So can you outrun a bad diet? Well, I know people who can run so much that the answer is yes. And it really depends how much you run, because most
Yes.
people are not going to run. For instance, if you're running 100 miles a week, you can pretty much eat whatever you want. When I was in college, I used to run a lot. I mean, I always tell people I'm too fat to run now, but when I could run in college, I could eat anything. I mean, literally anything. And it was almost like I had to kind of force myself to eat. So there are those few people who could outrun a bad diet vis-a-vis weight. Let's talk about health. Okay. In terms of health, so if you look at health span, longevity, et cetera, the single best behavior you could do for your health is to exercise. So whether it's running, cycling, lifting, or whatever, that in a way takes care of maybe eating like crap to a point. The problem is this: most people who exercise or exercise seriously, they always end up changing their diet because they realize that their diet affects how they feel when they train. Now that's a little different than the Calvin Johnson example. In fact, it reminded me when, and I hope this is true, but I remember when Usain Bolt said he loved eating chicken McNuggets. And I'm thinking, okay. Well, he's in a sport that lasts 10 seconds. His training is almost all ATP PCR energy system, anaerobic energy system. Could he get away with it? Yeah, because, fuel during exercise is basically what's stored in your skeletal muscle. And in the same way, Calvin Johnson, I mean, again, sprint type athlete, he's not doing anything for a prolonged period of time per se. I think with performance, I think you can out-train it or outrun it to a point. And then what happens? You get older. And so you're like, whoa,
Yes.
I'm not recovering the way I used to. And I think that's what happens. In fact, I almost think it's a waste, not a waste. It's very difficult to get into the mind or the brain of a young athlete who is super talented. It's like, for them, it's been easy. They're like, high school is easy, college is easy. Now they're a professional athlete. They're like, I'm still better than most people in the world. And now you're telling me I need to eat this and not eat this. They're like, screw you. And then what do you know? They hit age 30 and it's like, whoa, I'm not recovering like when I was in college. And I think age is a great teacher. And I think after a certain amount of time, you do have to change the way you eat. And put it this way, I'll take the Tom Brady example, although he's kind of a unicorn. And in fact, let's compare him to Aaron Rodgers, who's not playing very well at age 40. Tom Brady was playing very well at age 45.
Yeah.
So what did Tom Brady do? And people like to make fun of him. And I've made fun of him sometimes with the way he eats or whatnot. But think about this. It's not so much the way he eats per se. Think of the things he didn't do. He didn't eat junk. He took care of his body. He always worked out. He never got fat. So, I mean, people focus on, hey, this is the TB12 method. How about this? Look at the stuff he didn't do. I never heard any stories of him staying out late doing stupid stuff. So let's face it, athletes, they stay out late, they do stupid stuff. Before you know it, they're 30 years old and they're washed up. It's like, just think if they had taken care of their bodies vis-a-vis diet over all that time, how much better they'd be. But again, here's the thing. With age comes wisdom. You know that when you're in your 20s, you're invincible, right? You're invincible. So you're like, yeah, diet. I could drink, 6 beers, have McNuggets, go drive through Taco Bell, and then wake up the next day and I'm fine. I'm not saying I did that, but you know what? I have friends who did. So
Yeah.
it's I don't know who came up with the saying, but the problem with youth is it wasted on the young. So that's the problem.
Isn't that the truth? Hey, students, you didn't hear me agree with that. And let me also, just for my students' sake, say that I would never advocate for a bad diet. I just think it's a really interesting question. And again, I love the way you answered it. It's not, kind of in a quick review, it's not sustainable. So don't do it. You really should optimize
Yeah.
things, from the start. Why not be optimal from the start? And then, because if you aren't, then at some point you're going to have to change it because it's going to come back to kick you in the butt. But I just want my students to understand, I would never advocate for a bad diet, but I do find it interesting topic. And in those 3 categories, there are examples where you can outrun it for a period of time, but it's just not sustainable.
Yeah. Now I will commend one group, male bodybuilders, more so than any other group, are really good with dialing in their diet. And the reason they're really good with it is they know diet is a fundamental part of the sport.
Yes.
So you take them, they know how much they know how much carbs, how much fat, how much protein, how many calories they're eating. And no other athlete, and I have bodybuilding friends who say, well, we're not really athletes. We just try to look pretty, which, I guess if that was true, then being Miss Universe would be athletic, right? But put that aside, they know exactly what they eat. And if other athletes sort of, paid attention to what bodybuilders did, I think they would be much better off.
Yeah. And again, you just hit on a continuum because on a continuum,
Yep.
they're at the extreme end. And so people will be like, oh, well, they're bodybuilders, blah, blah, blah. I actually think we can learn from them in certain ways. Do we need to be that extreme? Absolutely not. But can we learn the importance of, you know, basically being really mindful of what you're doing from a eating
Yeah,
standpoint? So there's things we can learn that everybody can learn from the continuums. And so yeah, I love it.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
All right, a couple more questions for you. The next one is related to needs analysis. So, in exercise science, performing a needs analysis for an athlete often involves evaluating the athlete as well as their sport. So, you want to look at the athlete and you will look at the sport through
Mhm.
movement analysis, physiological analysis, and injury analysis as you're looking at the sport to determine the best approach to their how you're going to program their training. How does a needs analysis in sports nutrition compare? Is it more complex or is it different in the way it assesses an athlete's nutritional needs?
I think a needs analysis is actually simpler in sports nutrition or nutrition in general compared to training. I mean, and 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 I always, what I'll ask this question to students in terms of training. I say, what do you think are the most complicated sports to train for? And they'll say stuff like maybe ultra discipline, or they'll pick a high end sport or high skill sport. And I often say the two hardest sports to train for, and they'll laugh when I tell them this, is tennis and fighting. And they're like, tennis? Well, okay. Tennis and fighting have a couple things in common, other than in tennis, you don't get punched in the face. Movement patterns are very complicated. They move forward, they move backwards, they move sideways. Um, the energy systems, you got to train all energy systems. You can't just be someone with a lot of power. You got to train endurance, because face it, in fighting, and at least in MMA championship fights, 5 minutes, 5 rounds, 5 minutes. In tennis, you could be playing 5 sets. You could be out there for hours. So there's an endurance component to it, as well as a power component and speed component for both. The other thing is just the skill set required for tennis, very high. Skill set required for fighting, very high. And so when I talk about, looking at a needs analysis, like when you're training a tennis player or a fighter, you got to be really careful, because there's so many skill sets that are involved, that if you're a strength and conditioning coach, you just got to be careful that you don't ruin the athlete, because they have skills. They have coaches that just deal with skill. So when you're talking about the needs analysis for them, very complicated. But let's take the nutrition side, same group of athletes. Well, let's take fighters. They train multiple different disciplines, oftentimes twice a day. And let's leave aside fight camp, where they are progressively losing weight. So in general, they might be training twice a day. In terms of nutrition, this is where it's interesting, because they don't want to go to a different weight class. So they have to be cognizant of not gaining too much weight. Now, typically their fight weight is maybe 20 pounds less than their walk around weight. So let's say you're fighting at 170, but your walk around weight is 190. They just got to be really careful not to exceed, let's say, that 190 threshold, because it makes it that much more difficult to lose weight. So they have to be cognizant of calories, number one, cognizant of protein, because it's important for recovery. And then they typically backfill the rest of their diet with carbs and fat. Now, in terms of supplements, let's say again for the mixed martial arts athlete, because to me, it's still the most complicated sport. Again, should they take creatine? Again, it depends who you ask. Some say yes, some say no. Maybe they should help with recovery and then titrate it down. Beta alanine they should take, helps them train. The nitrates help them. Caffeine pre-workout will help them. And again, just being cognizant of protein intake. And if you do those basic things, which I think is simpler than the training part, because there's so much involved in training, I think you can cover 99% of what an athlete needs. And, what about all the other stuff that isn't necessarily related to performance? And I always give the example of glucosamine. Hey, it may not impact that athlete's career now, but maybe it'll impact how they are 10 to 15 years from now. Again, most people don't think 10 to 15 years ahead of time. But I think eventually you got to quit fighting or playing tennis or whatever your sport is. And now you got to just worry about being functional and being healthy.
Yeah, good. I love it again.
Yeah.
All right, let's move on. Let's move on to the next question. And then I think I'm gonna have one last question for you, just kind of related on career advice, maybe, which it'll be a little
Okay,
off topic, but in any case,
okay.
principles of sports nutrition, such as optimizing macronutrient and micronutrient intake, hydration, nutrient timing, and calorie control, are designed to help athletes improve performance, like we've been talking about, in body composition. If we apply
Mhm.
these same principles to the general population, we could potentially see significant improvements in public health and overall wellness. From your perspective, and actually, I'm going to ask you the question, but I'm going to say one other thing real quick. So, from your perspective, what are the key lessons or approaches from sports nutrition that could or and should be applied to the general nutrition to create healthier and more informed society? And one last thing, where I come from on this, and I'll be curious your view on this, is that in sports nutrition, we're more objective because we're dealing with athletes and we want to know a little bit more about, just the thing,
Mhm.
numbers, basically, your body weight, like you just said, protein intake. We're a little bit more quantitative, a little bit more objective, where I just feel like with the general pop, it leans way too far on the continuum, being subjective, and we're kind of losing that objectivity, which could help with health. So, with all that said, I would love your input on this.
Yeah, I think a lot of the principles that we use in sports nutrition for people who are exercise trained or for athletes, it could apply to the general population. However, I think for the general population, I don't think these principles are things they can adhere to over the long run.
Gotcha.
So for them, and put it this way, I will get asked questions from not from serious athletes. And when I say serious athletes, people who have a goal. I'll get questions in terms of, what they should do to just improve their health or fitness. And oftentimes, if they don't have a specific goal, I tell them, I'm not even trying to answer that, because you say you want to be more fit, but I don't even know what that means. So I think the principles could apply to the general population. The challenge is, I don't think it would work, because oftentimes, in a way, it's too complicated. If you talk about nutrient timing and looking at your macro intake and micro intake and calorie control, et cetera, I think people's eyes will just roll over to like, just,
Yeah.
tell me what the secret is. Should I sit in a cold tub for 10 minutes? Because they want the secrets. And it's like, there's no secrets. In fact, the things that work are kind of boring and repetitive, and you got to do it consistently every day. So
Yeah.
when I talk about nutrition to the general population, again, I keep it really simple, really simple. For instance, I'll say, well, you eat a lot of junk, so could you just eat less junk? You like eating cookies or whatever. How about, instead of eating cookies 3 times a week, how about eat it like once or twice a week? I mean, simple stuff like that. I never tell people, hey, don't ever do this, because once you do that, they're gonna like do the opposite. And then the other thing I tell is just emphasize protein, because it is the one macronutrient
Yeah.
that is difficult. It's difficult for a lot of people to get enough of it. Like I told you before, nobody's ever come up to you, Jeff, and said, you know what? I'm having a hard time getting carbs in. What should I do?
Yeah.
Give me some foods to eat so I can, get my carb intake high. Same with fat. I mean, no one has a hard time getting enough fat. So again, the principles are good, but I don't know, in terms of your population work with, but I tend to just, I'm around people who are highly motivated
Yeah.
and highly trained. So it's almost like a different population of people. I don't typically work with general population.
Yeah. Okay. My last question for you is just, you and I have got, know each other through social media, but these two podcast interviews are the first time that we've been able to talk. And it's been
Mhm.
fascinating for me to listen to you. And, we cover a wide range, well, somewhat wide range of topics, and it's fascinating to listen to you. And one of the things that goes through my mind is, when you're talking to a subject matter expert like yourself, and the ease with which you answer questions, and the confidence with which you answer questions, and the accuracy with which you answer questions, and that all came from somewhere. And so so my question to you is, just from like an origin story, career standpoint, how, in your pathway, how did you
Yeah.
get to the point from a student, five 500 years ago. No, I'm just kidding. But how'd you
Feels
get
that
to
way.
but how'd you get to, in a as succinctly as you can, how did all this happen where you got to the point where with the, where you're at, CEO of the ISSN and your confidence and all that stuff? It's fascinating to
You
me.
know, it's kind of it's a journey in that I planned almost nothing. That seems really odd. They're like, oh, you planned none of this. I'm like, I actually really didn't. In fact, when I got my PhD, I did my PhD at the University of Texas, Southwestern Medical Center. It's in Dallas. And I graduated in 93. I did a 2-year postdoc. So I finished my postdoc in 95, 96. And after that, I actually had no plans. It's like, oh, what am I going to do? So, and this is before the internet. This is what's kind of interesting. It's not like you could just go on social media and look for people. So I was like, you know what? I don't really want to get an academic job. So I contacted people. I don't know. I'm older than you, so I don't know if you're going to remember this. You remember the Weeder publications, Flex, Muscle and Fitness,
Oh,
Shape
absolutely.
Magazine?
Absolutely.
Right. When print magazine used to be, big and cool. So I actually contacted them and I said, hey, do you need a sports science editor kind of thing? And they actually replied and said, you know what? How about we fly you and we'll interview you? Blah
Wow.
blah blah. I'm like, cool. So they flew me to Woodland Hills, California. They actually offered me the job. Now here's the thing: I didn't want to move. I said, how about this? Pay less, but I want to stay in Texas. No, they're like, okay. So I never planned that. Years I literally worked out of home, typing on my computer, sending them my articles, and it's like, hey, this is kind of cool. And then, and my wife could attest to this. Basically, things come to me, whether by accident or me looking for them, projects that I think, wow, that would be kind of fun. I think I want to do that. So, you know, part of getting a PhD, I tell students, is that it'll open doors that you may not even knew existed. So let me give you a couple examples of doors that I didn't know existed. One, in addition to the academic door, because that's always open. I at one point owned a coffee company from 2003 to 2009. We sold the coffee company. So I was like, who would have thought I would own a coffee company? The ISSN, we formed it in 2003. And the reason we formed it was we were getting our ass handed to us, because we actually thought sports nutrition was legitimate and sports supplements were legitimate. So we were just getting roundly criticized by, I hate to say it, mostly ACSM members that, they're like, man, these guys are just nuts. They think supplements are like worthwhile. And I'm like, I think they are. And there's only one way to find out, and that's to do research. So, like, for instance, all the things that I've written on sports nutrition, in terms of peer-reviewed pubs, and I tell students this all the time. I say, that's all self-taught. And I tell them, most of what you're going to learn after you get out of school is not what you learned in school. It's what you teach yourself out of school. And the whole point of going to school, hopefully, is to teach yourself how to teach yourself so that when you get out, I say, don't make this mistake. You graduate with whatever, EDD, PhD, MD. Don't think you know everything, because you will soon realize you don't know shit. And that you got to keep teaching yourself and teaching yourself and teaching yourself, because 10 years down the road, especially in sports nutrition, if you just kind of forget reading stuff for 10 years, you are way behind. It's like, holy geez, what just happened? It's like a new world out there. So for me, my interest in science has always been sports nutrition. However, I knew again, going back pragmatically, I knew back in the 90s, there was no way I was ever going to do that. So I actually studied muscle physiology. But after I got my PhD, I said, you know what? Now I can do whatever the hell I want. I'm going to use my PhD to study whatever the hell I want. So
Yeah.
I tell students, don't get bogged down in what you do for your doctorate. Don't get bogged down in it, because it's just a means to get somewhere else. So let's say for your doctorate, you studied, I don't know, postmenopausal women, but really you're interested in high-end athletes or whatever. Once you get your advanced degree, seek out those people who work in that population and teach yourself this, because sports nutrition, if you look at the people who publish now, I mean, and I've known a lot of these guys now for 20 years, all of it is self-taught. There was no textbook in the 1990s on sports nutrition. It literally, it's just in us talking to each other. We go to conferences, we talk. So I think one of the biggest lessons students, and really anyone, even if you have an advanced degree, is you just got to keep teaching yourself this stuff and learning. And luckily, if you build enough of a network, I'll be honest, sometimes I'm lazy. I'm like, what the hell is this? So I'll text a friend of mine. I'm like, hey, have you seen this study? What does this mean? Could you just give me the like Cliff Notes version? That's an advantage you have when you create a good network. So create that good network, and you just got to keep teaching yourself and keep teaching yourself, because if you don't, you just fall behind so much. And one last story. When I was a kid, I remember my dad, he was a physician. So I'd sometimes go down to his office and I'd look at the titles of some of these books. I'm like, what does this even mean? So I didn't understand any of the science lingo, medical lingo. He's like, you know what? When you graduate, you have to keep reading. And when you tell that to a kid, you're like, oh my God, I got to keep reading? I don't like school as it is. He's like, yeah, if you don't keep reading, you're just gonna fall behind, and then you'll just be stupid. And I'm like, oh God, this stuff doesn't sound fun. And now, you realize as you get older, you're like, wow, my dad was right. You can't quit reading. You have to keep educating yourself. And that's why I think there are a lot of professionals out there, I won't mention them, once they get their initials, and I tell people, don't fall in love with initials. I don't care if it's MD, PhD, EDD, RD. Don't fall in love with your initials, because there's someone out there who knows a lot more than you, and they're going to embarrass you if you don't keep up. So the initials are great. It just shows you accomplished something.
Yep.
But some of the smartest people in the world don't have those initials. So just make sure you keep learning and you keep teaching yourself.
Yeah. And so the last question on that note, so what resources, because there's a lot of deception out there, there's a lot of bad resources, and if you could just a short list of like primary resources that you would suggest young students to make sure that they are part of their repertoire as they do continue to learn and teach themselves.
Yeah, I think, well, I'll be specific to sports nutrition. I think one of the best, if not the best resources that are available are the ISSN position stands.
Yes.
If you go to JISSN.net and you do a search of the position papers, we have over a dozen of them. And so even if you don't have a science background, if you look at the abstract and/or conclusion, it's written in a manner that it's meant for anyone to read. I mean, you could always look up
Yes.
some of the jargon, but to me, if you don't want to read all the literature, and let's face it, I can't even read all the literature. That's why I depend on friends oftentimes to tell me, it's like, hey, tell me about the study. I haven't read it and I don't feel like reading because I ain't got time. At least the position papers gives you a nice snapshot of the current state of the literature, whether it's for creatine, beta alanine, protein, the ketogenic diet, diets in general. And here's the interesting, we know that these papers, these position papers, are one of the most constantly cited, read, and downloaded papers in the literature. Why? Because, I mean, let's face it, people want they want it to be easy. They're like, okay, why should I read 50 papers when I could read one paper? The answer is, you're right. Read the one paper. Unless you're a professional scientist, then maybe you should read, 50 papers.
Yeah. Good. Dr. Antonio, thank you so much on behalf of myself, on behalf of my students, the institution. This has really been a lot of fun. It's been extremely informative. It's been fascinating, and I just really appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and let me know what your students think. 'Cause, yeah, I'd be really curious. I'd like to get that feedback.